David McIntosh, podcaster, comedian and consultant. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
It's good to be here. You've had some top level athletes on the show. You've had some UFC fighters, and now you've got a real killer on the podcast. If anyone's tuning in via camera, they know I'm definitely not a killer, that's for sure.
Killer on the stage. Fresh off the back of a couple of big performances in the weekend, actually. So, stand up in Glasgow, Friday, Saturday, doubleheader.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened. How was it?
So this is my first ever weekend show on a proper bill with professional comedians. The journey as a budding stand-up comedian is that you do open mic nights and new material nights, and the audience are kind of aware that you're trying new stuff. They're not usually paying too much for the show, so there's a level of forgiveness. But when you transgress into the weekend gigs, when people are paying like VIP packages to have Prosecco on a front row seat, then there's more pressure, especially as the new progression spot on the bill. So there was kind of added pressure of that, and also the venue that I was playing in was called Blackfriars. And that venue is the home of stand-up comedy in Glasgow. It's the original venue. Sir Billy Connolly played there. They're known for giving Kevin Bridges his first paid gig, Alan Carr, John Bishop, Lee Nelson. So there was a pressure of that as well. But I was ready for it. It was exciting. And I had a very polarising 2 nights. Friday was a bit of a hell night because I was over-caffeinated, underslept after a full working week. But also, it was a really rowdy crowd. There was one lady down the front who was off her chops, absolutely steaming. And the guy that was hosting, Lee, he went up and had a real battle with her. She kept on shouting out, and then the first comedian, the same again. And then she got kicked out just before I went on stage.
All right.
So the tone was quite hostile. So I just relieved the tension by saying, "Oh, who kicked out Emma?" I almost had my baby reindeer moment, and that kind of settled everyone back into seat. But it was hard yards, mate. It felt like cardio, to be honest. And I brought along a professional comedian called Darren Connell, a great friend of mine. He was in Scott Squad, and he sent me a voice note with feedback 5 minutes afterwards. He said, "David, you were doing your podcast voice up there. Be you." So on Saturday, I did just that. I went up and had a laugh. Same material, just delivered completely differently, and kind of took the roof off a bit.
Good.
And it's insane how the same material delivered in 2 different ways can have a completely different effect. And I really think it's because you give people the observation that you're 1 pint behind them if you're having a laugh on stage.
Yeah.
Whereas on the first night, it felt like more of a public speech.
Yeah. I can see how that would be tricky. Like, I've done a few public speeches myself, and the way in which you say things is really important, man. Like, you know, it's easy to come across sounding too serious.
Yep.
And I actually did, this was probably like my 5th time public speaking, but it was at my one of my good mates' wedding, and I decided to have like at least 8 pints before.
Oh my God.
And I hadn't done that before, so it was obviously a bit of a different experience, but really enjoyed it. I was scared actually to do that because I wanted to be clear in my mind and, you know, to kind of make sure I was concise in what I was saying. 8 pints in, and you know what, I would do it again. I would do it again that way, but obviously you're performing as a professional comedian, so that's probably not the done thing, is it? You know, like, do people loosen up before is that a thing?
So on that night, not a single comedian drank.
Really?
But they give the perception that they have.
Yes.
And I think they maybe do that to themselves as well. Maybe it's not conscious anymore, but what I would do is pretend that I've had a pint mentally, because what alcohol gives you is the removal of fear.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you need when you go on stage.
It is.
And if everyone's kind of half cut or steaming at the gig, you kind of need to showcase that you're their friend, essentially.
Yeah.
So if you can play the drunk, or play the piss head a little bit, it makes them feel better about being drunk as well, instead of just being patronising and labouring points across. So, like, some of my best gigs I've had 1 pint before.
Really?
Because it gives you that kind of loosey-goosey feeling. But I wouldn't recommend doing like 8 pints before a gig.
No, 8 pints. I also think though, like 1 pint, I think I'd rather do 2 or 3, because 1 pint would make me feel tipsy, but you know that way where you just start to feel a bit different?
We're different body weights, mate.
that's the key, innit? Yeah, that's a good point. So wait, both of the gigs were at Blackfriars, Friday and Saturday.
Friday and Saturday.
And you've done stuff in the stand.
Done stuff in the stand, yep.
And out of the gigs that you've done, So far, what's been your favourite? The Stand or Blackfriars?
The Stand is a walk in the park. They're there to see you do well, especially the Tuesday nights, which is their kind of new act, new material night. They're there for a good time. They're paying £4, £5 a ticket. They just want to laugh. They're forgiving, and it's a really good space to try new stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say that's a really good spot. But I guess one of my favourite gigs was one of my worst ever gigs, which was in London for a charity called Freedom from Torture. So I was down in London visiting a friend at the time, and I got a text message asking if I wanted to jump on this charity gig. So I gave the charity a Google, and I noticed that they did a whole performance at the Stand the year before, and it was a headline show, pro comedians, and I thought, oh my god, I get the opportunity to do that in London. It must be a crazy comedy club. But in fact, Adam, it was an office block, and I rocked up and I was greeted by this 90-year-old woman who told me that I was performing to a bunch of refugees for their Christmas night out.
Oh, you're having a laugh. What a stitch up.
So I went up on stage. Right before I went up on stage, she said, 300,000 people died of waterboarding this year, 200,000 people were starved, and 100,000 people were held captive. Welcome to the stage, David McIntosh. So that was the hardest gig ever, trying to get them on side, because she set the tone. And the people there weren't there for comedy, they were for the Christmas night out. And I went up and cracked a really rude joke instantly. I basically said something along the lines of freedom from torture, it will be when she shuts up.
That's a good one to start with. That's nice though, because that's like a happy medium. It's not, you could go up and be really over the top, but that's a nice balance.
Oh, they didn't like it. No, but you learn from that. You learn about how to tailor to your audience. Environment dictates everything. And you learn how to have that extra gear in your performance from those really bad gigs. Most comedians don't remember their best gig. They'll definitely never forget their worst.
Yeah.
And that was that for me.
I am really keen to delve into like where the sort of motivation to get into stand-up and all that came from, because it's obviously not something that most people would be up for doing. But take us back to, I guess your backstory. Like, where are you from? Like, what was your upbringing like? And now you live in Glasgow and you're doing different things, but like, how did you get to this point?
Yeah, it's definitely a story of distance travelled. Like, I grew up in a council estate on the west coast of Scotland, the Sunshine Coast of Ayrshire, in a town called Prestwick. In the neighbouring town, my dad grew up, Kilmarnock, which you might have seen on BBC's The Scheme. He grew up in that council estate in the 50s and 60s. He grew up in a large but poor household, domestically abusive household. He had paper rounds from the ages of like 5 to 15 where he'd give all the earnings back to his parents. He slept in the same bed as his 5 siblings. They all wore workwear jackets to keep themselves warm at night. So when I use the term disadvantaged to describe myself, I feel quite out of kilter because I had all the advantages that he never had. And so growing up, my dad was a veteran. He had left the army and he suffered greatly from PTSD and depression. And he navigated those symptoms with addiction, predominantly alcohol. And my mum was long-term unemployed in and out of low-paid employment. So the visibility of financial insecurity was front and centre in my life. Both my mum's and my dad's mental health conditions, you could place the word financial in front of because it was the root cause: financial anxiety, financial depression. And at the age of 11, I had my first sliding door moment. I used to sell tablet and fudge around the streets like every kind of origin story that you hear these days, but that was really the case. And I was counting the coppers, or for your English listeners, the change, in my uncle's house. And he said, "David, you're good at counting that money. You could be an accountant. They make a lot of money." And post hoc, post-rationalising that experience gave me 3 key components. Visibility of a career that I didn't know existed. Accountancy, finance. The validation of capability told me I was good at a skill that had high reward in a marketplace somewhere. And the last thing was reward attached to that. He told me I would make lots of money. So I visibly remember this kind of weird jackpot sound effect going off in my head. And I predicated the rest of my adolescence to that one remark. And it was only a few weeks later, Adam, I went into my neighbour's house and in the council estate. Most mums say the same thing. They say, "Oh son, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I remember saying, "An accountant." And she said to me, "David, how could you be an accountant? Your mum and dad dropped out of university. Your mum and dad didn't go to university. They didn't have jobs. pick something more realistic. And I remember like proverbially biting down on the gum shield and saying in my brain, fuck you, I'll do what I can.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that's not weird for an 11-year-old in Scotland to say. We swear from birth essentially.
Yeah.
But I actually remember saying like, fuck you, sorry for swearing. And I realised the reason I was able to do that was because of that interaction with my uncle. He validated that capability and he told me that I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And he had trusted me for the first time. So I overrid that moment. And it was only maybe a year or two later, I was in school in the assembly hall, and we had a celebrity guest. And it was Sir Tom Hunter, Scotland's richest man and first billionaire and global philanthropist. And I remember rolling my eyes at him thinking, oh, it must be nice. Must be good for you being Scotland's richest man. And then he told me he was from Cumnock, which is a town not far from me. And he told me that he sold groceries from the back of a van. And he became Scotland's richest man and was able to give away so much wealth for people that needed it. And having that local visible role model was like red diesel for that belief. So I remember going back to my business class and trying to Google what is an entrepreneur, what is a philanthropist. No fucking results because I couldn't spell the words. But then my teacher came over my shoulder and Googled it, and I learned what wealth was. And I realised that's also wealth is financial and non-financial. And I self-predicated my whole schooling on that one remark from my neighbour, and do what you can. So at that age, I realised the impact of financial insecurity and how much it meant to me. I realised that I had a skill set that was rewarded with financial results. So I went on work experience to a place called KPMG, where I now work, a multinational professional services firm, and I got that opportunity through a charity called the Social Mobility Foundation, who provide opportunities for kids from disadvantaged areas, and it's usually opportunity in terms of university placements, help with university or placements in places like KPMG. And I went down to London for the first time. It was the first time I wore a suit, besides a court hearing and a funeral. And I had this weird predisposition of what the accountancy and finance sector was. I thought it was all middle class, middle-aged white men in suits. But when I went down there, I realised it was quite a diverse industry to some degree, more diverse than what I thought. So that was also really great, having that visibility of people in careers just like me. So long story short, I started an apprenticeship there, a very unconventional route. And when I got through the doors there, I was very aware of my upbringing. I realised I didn't have the hereditary tool set that some of the more affluent apprentices might have, or the ones that the graduates had that went through the private schooling system in Russell Group universities.
Like what, for example? And were you 18 at this point? Was this out of high school?
Yeah, straight from school. So they had this class polish, the way they could speak up the hierarchy and have the confidence to do so, their ability to be performative in nature, their ability to use body language and dress appropriately for meetings, things such as that, some of the softer things. Whereas I had this gratitude complex that, oh, I'm going to get caught out. I snuck through the back door. I better not shake the boat too much. And I learned through Albert Laszlo Barabasi, a huge network scientist, that success isn't about performance, it's about perceived performance. So success must be performative in nature. It goes back to the construct of if a conker fell from a tree and no one was around to hear it, did it really happen? But if I have a gratitude complex whereby I'm not confident displaying my merit, then no one's around to hear it. And I soon realised that I had to be more performative in nature. And what that led me to, Adam, was sharing my story in the workplace for the first time. I did this is me session where I shared the story that I just spoke to you about. And lots of people attached themselves to that. They said, David, I come from a council estate, and it led to way more public speaking opportunities.
Was that tough, doing that at the start, like first time you've spoken in front of a group?
I think storytelling, especially when it comes to your own stories, like training a muscle. It's like your first day in the gym, you go in, you put pressure under the muscle. It hurts. You might only manage 1 or 2 reps or 1 set. And you leave the gym feeling a bit deflated. And you're sore for 2 or 3 days because you've dug into the tissue of your life. But over time, that grows back stronger, 1 layer of tissue at a time. And you're maybe able to do 3 reps this time, 4 reps, 5 reps. And that might mean in the storytelling context, you tell a personal anecdote or you speak about a trauma for the first time. And you over the period of like 12 weeks or a year or 12 public speaking opportunities, you then go from having a skinny bicep like I've got to then having guns like you. But metaphorically, I really mean that in terms of the sense of storytelling. So the second time I told the story, I was able to do it with more conviction and more confidence.
Yeah.
And over time, that led to me speaking to Her Majesty the Queen in 2020 and telling a full flavour story to her over Zoom.
Mental. We in rugby did the same thing, and I remember being 21 years old, playing at the Glasgow Warrior rugby team, a wee bit older than you were at this point, but we, the coach asked if we would, a couple of times a week, one of us would go up to the front of the team meeting and you would sit down on a seat and you would tell your backstory as to where you grew up, your family, blah, blah, blah. 10 minutes, and see the thought of doing it scared the living hell out of me. And I'd managed to escape it for about 6 months, and then eventually I had to go up and do it. And I remember just being so nervous, man. So nervous. And the crazy thing is now is comparing that to what that was like to now being able to do what it is that I can do effortlessly, like sit here and talk to you, there's cameras running or whatever. It's bizarre, like the amount that you can develop, and it's training that muscle. And that's really what it comes down to is I actually wrote an online course for young rugby players. And one of the chapters is basically around how to lead within your organisation or lead within your rugby team. And the core principle really around it is that you just have to start speaking. Like you just have to start doing it. Like you're not going to want to do it, and you're actually going to have to probably force yourself to do it. But once you do it once, twice, 3 times, you're going to be a different animal. You're going to feel different. You're going to be able to communicate differently. And that's how I learned to lead more. That's how I learned to communicate.
And that's the you displayed the kind of fiscal results, but you also have you get garner social results, which are you're more relatable to people, you have greater connections, you'll find your tribe. And I love this quote, I think it was Aubrey Marcus, he says, the ego is only available to receive praise, not love. So when you're given feedback, when you're being relatable into sharing your story, you truly feel it. It's not the ego that receives it. But equally, it enables growth at a faster rate, because if you show up to opportunities as your true self, the feedback that you get is based on your character, and you know how to adjust instantly. But you can be dismissive if you showcase an ego to an arena, because you can think, well, that wasn't me anyway showing up to that, so I don't need to fundamentally
I'm not taking
change.
responsibility over that.
Yeah. So it allows you to take greater responsibility.
Yeah.
And your story's not something to be ashamed of, regardless of what it is. I mean, we spoke on the way here that you're from Alva, and I'm from a council estate in Ayrshire. They're not sexy upbringings to some degree, but they're your weirdnesses to embrace. Like the chances of us being here are literally 4 trillion to 1. Our stories make us remarkable, and there's so much power and strength in them. You don't have to go from 0 to 1 million to be influential or remarkable. You just need to be better than you once were before and be able to communicate that message back to maybe people around you. There's a weird trope that you're the average of the 5 people you surround yourself with. Yes, that is the case, but it doesn't mean you need to renounce your tribe to become better and more prominent and more skilled. In fact, you can use your story and your ambition to curtail and empower people around you that aren't maybe living to the same standards that you are. You can uplift your communities through your story and provide better outcomes for them. Rising tides rise all ships. And yes, there might be times where people might be nihilistic and renounce the idea of that, but you should try, because there's nothing more rewarding since starting my podcast and championing social mobility than having other people say, I got my first job, or I applied for university, or I started a podcast because of you, David. That's wealth to me. Not 100 million in the bank because I renounced the tribe and found a new business opportunities, because I've helped people just like me improve their lives by 1%.
Yeah, it's so cool. I can definitely relate to that. Just like, I mean, you've probably got a much bigger audience than me with your podcast, but even out of the audience that I have, it's the messages that you get every so often from somebody to say, oh, listen to this and this really helped me. I had a psychologist on the podcast, ex-rugby player, and a couple of current rugby players listened to that and ended up now they work with him and they're really thankful for that. And if this wasn't happening, it wouldn't have come into fruition. So it is those little things like that that do remind you that there's no money involved in it. There's no actual reward, but it's that there is real sort of emotional niceness in it, and it's a nice experience to feel that. And I think like going back to the stories and like, you know, origin stories, I guess your origin story, when sitting up and listening to all my teammates give their backstory, the ones that were often the best were the ones that were like the rawest, and the ones that were like not good. You know, like I played with a guy when I played out in the US who had done jail time multiple times. You know, he was a Crip. He grew up in some serious sort of gangland territory, and he actually sat up in front of the team and he began talking. After about a minute, he just went silent, and he had to just be quiet for 2 minutes because he couldn't speak. He was breaking down, and he eventually managed to get it out, and it was so powerful. And often those ones are the most powerful. And it sounds like yours is like that. You've got one of those powerful stories, and I'm sure that day when you stood up and did the presentation, you managed to captivate people by telling your story. And again, where that's led you now is obviously through telling origin stories. But where did you go from then? So like this was back in 2020. Was it down in London?
So it was during the pandemic, so it was remote, which I think is quite nice because I had to show, like when I was telling the story, I was living in my dad's council estate. You could see that the backdrop of my bedroom was unchanged for 5 or 6 years because we didn't have the money to refurbish it. So it added context to the story. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing probably something similar to what I was wearing today. And I shared that I was caring for my dad, and they could kind of bring that to life, which was great. But that led me to speaking to the Queen through a kind of pathway of other public speaking opportunities. And I remember when I spoke to the Queen about the exact same story that I shared with you, people would message me. I went viral, by the way, because of the Queen. I can't believe I'm saying this, but the Queen's Zoom crashed. Her Wi-Fi went down mid-call. You'd think they'd have some good network down in Windsor Castle, Castle, but they didn't. So it was on Sky News, CNN, it was on every major news outlet across the world. And as a result, I would be receiving messages from people inside my work and outside of, oh, David, your story's so relatable, but I would never be so brave to share it. And that created some sort of laceration in my heart. I was heartbroken that there's people just like me who are unable to embrace their true selves. So that's why I started the podcast. It was that one moment I realised that there's so much merit in stories. So I just started reaching out to people in my close network. I didn't have an expansive network at the time. And the first person that I had on was a lady called Jen Gillies Pemberton. And she's a charity owner based in Manchester. You won't know her name. She's not prolific at all. She grew up in the 50s and was a young dyslexic CEO. And she was a woman. And I met her maybe a year before when I was going to my first training session with my work. I was at Paisley Station getting the taxi from Paisley to the airport, and my card was declined on a taxi. She asked if she could skip the queue and take my taxi, and she looked back, squinted at me and asked me to come in the taxi. And she told me her story, and I told her mine. And we created this amazing mentorship instantly. We cracked it off straight away. And every time she came back to Scotland from Manchester, she would come and visit me. And it made sense that she was my first guest on my podcast. Someone that no one ever heard of, but she spoke about the advantages and disadvantages of being a woman and dyslexic in leadership. And the feedback I got on that one episode 1 was amazing.
Was it?
Like, created activation energy to use origin stories as a self-development tool, which became the purpose.
Yeah, it's so cool. Like, so growing up in the area you grew up, Prestwick.
Yep.
Prestwick. In that kind of rough area, did you ever get sort of pulled under into any of the sort of things that you regularly see going on in these areas, you know, rougher sort of friend groups, bad behaviour, out drinking? But what happened there for you? You managed to avoid it?
I could see it, but I wasn't involved in it. It's very hard to not see that going on. I spent a lot of time around skate parks as a kid as well.
Me too.
Quite a lot of like drugs. And the skate park that I went to was one of these council ones that were propped up, and it was surrounding 2 areas that were really rough. 3 areas that were really rough, actually. It was right in the cesspit of that. A place called White City, a place called Lockside, and a place called Jabba. These 3 prominent council estates. So they would fight right at the skate park because it was a middle ground for them all. But luckily enough, one of the kind of upsides of having a veteran dad is that he's quite harsh in punishment, to put it lightly.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember he said, David, if you ever touch a drug, I'll kick you out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
He said that when I was like 4 or 5. I remember it so young.
Mm-hmm.
And that scared me, entirely scared me. So I didn't even underage drink until,
Really?
not once. I had my first drink when I went to Magaluf when I was 18, on a school, like after school thing. Because I was so scared of my dad, terrified of my dad, because he was this tough-nosed veteran guy. I was terrified of my dad growing up. So that scared me away from all that behaviour, thankfully. But also, at the age of 16, I listened to podcasts, maybe less than that, maybe
Did
14,
you?
15. I listened to Gary Vaynerchuk,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the most prominent podcasts I listened to him with was with Seth Godin.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember walking to school listening to that. I was very unconventional as a kid. And it's just so strange that I've had Seth on the podcast like a few years later. But I was a bit of an introvert at school because of my upbringing. I was really ashamed of not having new clothes every year. I was really ashamed of having free school meals. And when we went from primary school to secondary school, I didn't follow my old friends into their new friend groups because I was ashamed. So I used to eat my lunch under the stairs by myself. And my dad would often come, because he was unemployed, he would come at lunch and to bring me a hot dog, a roll over a hot dog, and we'd go and watch the planes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only when I went to that new environment, the work experience with KPMG, I came back from that summer with a shaved head, not a shaved head, but like a fade.
Mm-hmm.
I put on a blazer for the first time. I lost a bunch of weight over summer. I became ripped. And I went into school as a new character. I redefined my identity and my outcomes.
What age would you have been?
I would have been like 16.
It's young, man.
Yeah. And I realised that I don't have to be a subject of my environment. I don't have to be the people that are around my council estate because of that one environment change
Mm-hmm.
at such a young age. But I understand why young people conform. It's a sense of safety. These skateboard gangs or these knife gangs, for example, there's a clear dominance hierarchy and there's a clear pathway to get to that kingpin level.
Mm-hmm.
If only these people could see that in other environments, the workplace, education, the creative space, then maybe they had relatable role models at the top of that,
Mm-hmm.
they could change their outcomes. It's why, like, if you see these prison case studies, I forget the name of it, but there's a charity that goes into prisons and creates up like record labels. And because there's a clear level of expressionism and hierarchy in the prisons, they change their energy from fighting in prisons to creating music.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's rap music or something to do. It's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's insane how intertransferable our motivations can be if we just change our environments. So for me, changing my environment and having a very disciplined, hard-nosed dad really
Mm-hmm.
disallowed me to fall into the pitfalls of the council estate.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because that can go sometimes two ways. It can go the way of, yeah, I'm going to follow because I'm scared or whatever, or it can be, I'm going to rebel.
It's carrot and stick.
Yeah. I know people that have been under sort of really strict parental guidance and, discipline who just went the other way. But maybe there wasn't enough fear, because if the real fear, I think, and real sort of discipline, I feel I would act the same way. I'd conform to that and not do what he was telling me not to do.
Well, I think it's because I had carrot and stick.
Mm-hmm.
I had the stick of my dad's going to be on my case if I take a drug or I'm in a fight. But because I had that early on experience, I also had the carrot. I knew what a perspicacious life could be.
Mm-hmm.
So I had
it was
both
a good
sides.
age to get that.
Yeah. And my job now as a podcast host with the podcast is to showcase 100 plus versions of that story in different ways, so people can see whatever industry that they have a fancy in, the roadmap to get there, so they have carrot and stick. I've also had people like high school shooters and death row inmates on my podcast, so they can see the repercussions of bad behaviour and violence and trauma, and steer away from that because they can see the outcomes attached to those bad habits and bad actions.
Yeah. I think when I moved to Glasgow at 18, away from Alva, finished high school, went into the Glasgow Warriors Rugby Academy, I had the same thing as you. It was like a change of environment. And I had my mates back home who were doing certain things, not really doing anything bad, to be honest. They were a good group of lads, still mates of mine now. But it really allowed me to sort of grow up and change perspective and evolve a little bit quicker than they had. That sounds bad saying it. And, you know, I probably just evolved a bit faster, and obviously they caught up in time. But I do think that's really important, is getting out your comfort zone. When I was 20, I went to New Zealand for 3 months on a rugby scholarship, and, you know, first time being away from home. But I grew up, man. Like, that really made me grow up when I was out there.
Yeah.
And I do think it's an important thing for people to flee the nest, you know, as youngsters, and get out there and just break away from what you're used to.
Yeah, I really believe that too. I think there's 3 forms of intelligence, and we underappreciate the latter. There's IQ and EQ. Actually, let me phrase that differently. There's skills and experience. So skills are uniquely identifiable skills that you and I would understand: accounting, bookkeeping, engineering. Experience is that skill replicated either across an industry for a certain duration. So if you look at a CV, skills or bookkeeping, experiences, demonstration of that skill and what company for how many years. But there's a third that's never on a CV, which is, I call it AQ, adversity quotient. Mm-hmm. And it's the internalization of overcoming resilience. So if you and I went through the same trauma or the same event, we would actually internalize it very differently based on our own perspective. And if you can embrace that perspective, that's a form of intelligence. Mm-hmm. It's called culture capital.
Yeah, I like that.
And if you go into, for example, your New Zealand experience, you will have had a remarkable experience there mm-hmm. that only you have internalized and learnt from. And I think to live a long life, you don't really need to live a long life. You just need to have lots of novelty and intensity. Mm-hmm. And you can gamify that. You can be selective and elective with that. Mm-hmm. And it seems like you did that with going to New Zealand and your rugby career thereafter. But I don't think we are encouraging that enough in the youth of today.
Yeah. Novelty and intensity, that's a really good way to put it. That was my professional rugby career. Because if you think about it, you've got a game every week. For 80% of the year, you get a bit of time off in the summer to recover. But 1 week you're in the team, next week you're not in the team. Then you get back in, you have a good game, you have a shit game, you get dropped again. So it's this absolute roller coaster that you experience the whole time mm-hmm. of getting what you want, not getting what you want, not really being told why you're not getting it. And I think like that is the one thing that I would say that is a little bit different about like just a normal job or than professional sport is the peaks and troughs, the intensity that you are exposed to. Mm-hmm. And it's really good. And it does it. I think that in itself is really good it's tough and it's hard and it breaks a lot of people. The amount of guys that you see retiring early from professional sport, certainly in rugby, just because they're just like, I can't do this anymore. I just want to go and get a normal job that doesn't have the highs and lows of sport. It's massive. But I felt like the exposure to that intensity and like volatility and not really knowing where you stand developed a lot of that, what you're talking about. What did you say? It's like AQ.
I call it AQ or RQ, adversity quotient or resilience quotient.
It's exposure to how to deal with the ups and downs. That's really what it was. And
if I think about why we gel and why most of my friends are my friends, is not because we have the same background, but it's because we all elect hardship. Mm-hmm. I have friends whose parents are multi-millionaires. I'm friends with celebrities through the podcast, which is a total fortunate thing to say. I'm not bragging when I say that. But I also have amazing friends that I grew up around in council estates. Mm-hmm. We've all electively showcased hardship and resilience. And I think they're the most interesting people because they always have the most interesting stories. Mm-hmm. Always.
Yeah, I totally agree.
It gives an interesting life and a great character.
Yeah. It's sort of a really introspective sort of way of looking at things that. So I guess now, how does your life look? So like you came through the apprenticeship at KPMG and you're now working, what were the steps after that?
So people have this weird perception that to be an entrepreneur or do something creative, you must quit the 9 to 5 and renounce that life. Mm-hmm. That's bullshit. I think there's more nobility in sticking down a full-time job and then electing that hardship by doing a creative endeavor or creating a side hustle or starting a podcast. Because what a 9 to 5 gives you is financial security. It satisfies the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at least for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need to quit your career to enable and satisfy your curiosity. I've had about 16 different careers at KPMG. I started a rotational apprenticeship program that I went around audit, tax, and all these other fundamental components. And then I became Scotland's first management consulting apprentice. Management consultancy is basically business advisory. You've got quite an intellectual audience, so I won't labour what that is. But recently, I started to really care about social mobility and helping people transgress social classes through education and employment. But the way I describe social mobility is a bit of ease or friction between an individual and their awareness, therefore access to opportunity. So I started a network at KPMG of over 1,000 people where I help them bring their identity to work. So I've scratched that, what could have been an external charity, internally with the safety of a salary.
Mm-hmm.
I've closed that curiosity loop. I've recently become a people consultant in management consultancy, which is basically helping financial services organisations, big banks, satisfy their workforce needs. And the reason I do that is because I've learned through Rory Sutherland on the podcast about behavioural science, around productivity, motivation, employee well-being. So I'm scratching that itch for a bit. I'm working in AI quite a lot and its impact on the workforce quite a lot. I'm interested by technology. Therefore, I'm satisfying all these itches with the safety of a salary and then doing my side hustles outside of work. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to say to your listeners, like, fuck the 9 to 5, quit and pursue your dream. Why don't you do both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the safest route, 100%. Like, if you can cover off what you need with the money that you earn from that and then explore outside.
It's such a luxury belief that quit the 9 to 5, fuck the 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Like, I can't do that. I've got a vulnerable dad who I need to have money, a safety net to, in case I ever need to use it to help him at some point. I need to pay rent. I'm not moving back in with my dad. I can't do that. It's not a happy environment for me. And I love hearing stories whereby other people have those side hustles too. I think it's incredible. I'm not casting myself as a superhero for doing that at all, by the way. I don't want to say I'm exceptional. We can all do that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You need to be sensible about it and smart, you know, and I think it's another thing that, like, often, like, athletes coming out of sport, it's a difficult thing for them to sort of work because, like, you've been doing something that you really enjoyed for like 10 years and then you need to finish up and retire through injury or whatever and then go into a job that, like, for most people it is a 9 to 5. That's not what they want to go into for the most part. They want to go in to be able to do something that they actually like or are passionate about, whatever. But to get to that point actually takes a long time. It's the best part of 2 or 3 years, and that's with already having a profile that you've built up and you've got an audience already. And I think, like, there's a lot to be said for leaving sport or, you know, whilst you're building a side hustle, to have something there that is fundamentally supporting you and you can do well and earn money from before you actually put all the pressure onto yourself of having to make it work through other means. So I totally agree.
Yeah, I really feel sorry for the youth of today. I think there's a perfectionist paradox because young people now have instant access to a Yellow Pages or a catalogue. It's like an Argos catalogue, which is social media. And what they see on that is things that they don't have with people they don't know in places they'll never be. So they are expected to get things right first time. They always see the end result on social media. Not the failures. Never see the failures. Like, Adam, 4 years ago I started this podcast that I have, and I did 400 plays in 3 months. Last month, in the last 28 days, I've got 250,000 views on my podcast.
Insane.
I never started with that at all. And I really feel sorry for the youth of today because they are never encouraged to start. And it's exemplified and accelerated by us having instant surveillance systems on our phones. They're scared to... What we used to practice in private, we now have to practice in public because everyone's got a phone on them. And when I have a son, I'm going to force him to do stand-up comedy. Or maybe encourage him.
Drag him on stage.
Because you learn so much from it.
Yeah,
like, it's such an instant feedback loop. It's such a high level of rejection therapy. Yeah. You start off with an idea. It's almost like a smell of a joke. It's this idea of something that might work. It's really fat in nature. It's like 20% body fat. And every time you try that joke, you're slowly losing weight of the joke. And you take it from something that doesn't work, is loose, over 20 performances, and then you have something that's really tight and lean. But that reiterative process is so fundamental for growth. But kids are discouraged to do that because they only see the reward. They don't see the process. But also, I'm really aware that kids do not know what they want to want. And that's because of the eradication of boredom. I think boredom's got a branding problem. We see it as a state, not a symptom. I think the symptom is an influx of creativity with nowhere to go. All great comedians have probably been through some trauma. And the reason they were able to embrace and overcome that trauma is because of imagination. They were able to take something that was so hard and difficult and put rose-tinted glasses on and change the experience of that. Like, the reason I started stand-up comedy was because my mum passed away. And my very first set, my first 5 minutes, was being tongue-in-cheek about that experience. Like, the reason the telephone exists isn't because Alexander Graham Bell was well-connected. The reason the TV exists isn't because John Logie Baird was fascinated by books. The reason the vibrator exists is for a very similar reason, right?
Yeah.
But there's so much innovation and boredom. But now the kids have instant access to dopamine. It's ruined that state of boredom. So now we need to gamify and be elective with boredom. Kids should spend more time on buses without headphones on. They should spend more time in Glaswegian council estate cafes with no distractions. They should spend more time with their thoughts. Overthinking isn't a problem. Underthinking is a problem.
Just being numb.
Yeah.
That is really, really nicely put, really, really well articulated. I completely agree. It's another part of this online course that I've just made. I sound like I'm rambling on here about it, but the ability to fail is such a great thing. And I've honestly, I don't know if it's just because you've came into my circle more recently, but I have been thinking about what it would be like to do stand-up comedy.
Do it.
Like, and for the exact reason that you're talking about.
I'm going to look at the camera and say, I'm going to take Adam to an open mic night.
Maybe, man, maybe. I don't know.
Don't be a maybe, man.
The only reason that I'm actually saying this is for the same reason that you are, like, to be able to expose myself to that feedback loop and to use it to just like get better, like, and to see that happening. There's so much like fruitfulness in that.
Do you do cold water therapy? Have you ever done ice baths?
Yeah, I've done it loads, yeah.
It's the exact same as that. Instant pain followed by instant reward.
Yeah. And again, that's what the whole thing, the module in the online course was about, is that like we need to re-look at the way that we're looking at failure. Like, we don't want to fail, but we actually have to fail. You have to fail.
Failure's got a branding problem as well.
It has. It's like, just because you've failed 100 times does not make you a failure. It just is that you've failed in something, and because you've failed, you've then got the lessons that you had to get to learn, and then that's how you become successful. So
fail fast, never big.
Yes, exactly. And I just don't think that we look at it properly. And you know, I think what you said about boredom there and sitting and just allowing your mind to not be distracted by instant gratification, things like sitting on buses, things like going for walks, things like just having conversations with people, man. Our youth are not doing it.
Yeah. Boredom is solitude. And what solitude is a state whereby you're negated from the input of other minds. And boredom teaches you what you want to want.
It does. Because there's a saying, and it's something like along the lines of like, all desire comes from darkness. And like, when you say something like that, people think like darkness is like real depression, like horribleness, but it's not really like that. Ultimately, we need to feel something to make us act. You know, like, why would I do anything if I don't feel anything? Like,
can I share my favourite quote? You'll love this.
Go for it.
I think you'll relate to this. When a young mind is animated by scenes that engage the heart, traits that would otherwise lay dormant wake into life and form the character of the superhero. Nice.
I like that. It's we need to be exposed to things that make us feel like we want to act. Like, that's really, and failure's a really good thing for us to be exposed to, because it actually like provides us with what we need to learn the lessons. And that's like to me, that's like a a satisfying life. It's a satisfying way of living. You know, I do have this like belief through some of the things that I've explored that, you know, sort of underneath the mind, everything is absolutely perfect. Like through meditation, through exploring sorts of different, you know, Buddhist books, writers and stuff like that. I do have this almost like, it's like a bit of a contradiction in some ways, because I do think, and I've had some experiences of this, that what the mind is made of is actually perfection. It's warmth, it's love, it's perfection. But we live in this finite mind, in this finite world, and one of the ways that we actually do get a real sense of like satisfaction, gratification and development is by doing hard things that we probably don't really want to do, but then overcoming the challenges that we face along the way. And it's a different... It's not like you're just sitting on a park bench and watching the world go by completely happy. That is maybe what some people can achieve, and maybe some of these like monks and Buddhists can achieve. But for most people, you can have a sense that everything underneath the surface really deeply is okay. But it doesn't mean that you don't live a life of achievement and trying to succeed and growing and developing and learning. And yeah, it's been a bit of a contradiction for me at times, because I do sit myself in both camps there. I don't know like if there's any sort of relatability to you with that, but you're somebody who, you know, I've not known you that long, but you're somebody who is out achieving stuff, and you're really working hard to evolve and develop.
You've really just described that third form of intelligence, that RQAQ. Like, you put it better there than I ever could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. It's like almost like trying to figure out the divide between the space that resilience comes up in, like, because it is there's a sense that like the challenges that we face are not us, but there's a sense that we actually are them as well, and that's quite a complicated concept to try and explain. But
I've been wrestling with the idea. Do you know that phrase that you see on Instagram, stories that people share, or like your mum shares on Facebook? It's "you're not your thoughts."
Yeah,
I have the same toil with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you are not, I sometimes believe you're nothing but your thoughts. Mm-hmm. You're nothing but the inner monologue that you have. Mm-hmm. You need to love the story that you tell to yourself about yourself. Mm-hmm. Your inner monologue is a noisy roommate. And if you don't like the noise that's coming from the roommate, you need to change the roommate, or remove the roommate, or learn to like the roommate.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm in the other school of thought of, your thoughts are just, you don't choose your thoughts, they come up as they do, and you shouldn't label yourself and identify as them. So I'm toiling between that phrase, you know?
Yeah, that's the exact same contradiction in some ways. Yeah, I think you can't escape your thoughts. So the easiest way, I think, to change your experience is by evolving yourself, developing yourself, setting goals and achieving your goals. Because what that's going to do to your experience, let alone will change your relationship with yourself, because of the things that are going to happen within your brain and in your experience, dopamine. And that's the path that most people tend to go down, I think. It's the most trodden path. But there is another path, I think.
It's why so many mid-20-something-year-olds are struggling at the moment, or just struggling in general. I had a lady called Dr. Meg J on my podcast, a clinical psychologist who focuses on adolescent development. And she taught me that your 20-something decade is the most difficult decade of your life. And I thought, what? Yeah. Surely you're having fun, you've got no responsibility, you can take risks. And she said, oh, that's not the case. And it's because you don't have any sort of pattern recognition. You don't have a previous data set to make new decisions from, because you haven't walked the walk yet, and you don't have a feedback loop. So I think it's so important in your 20s to do challenging things, because you give yourself that data set so you can make trusted, informed decisions in the future.
Totally agree. I'm 30 now, so I'm barely out of my 20s, but my 20s were my most challenging years that I've had. Now, obviously, when you're like 0 to 10, you don't really remember much of it, but in teenager, you know, like, it's all just about exploring things and having fun. And again, but the 20s were really the maturing period where you actually have to become an adult, and you have to work through a lot of the deficiencies within your personality, and you're exposed to things that you never knew were in there. You know, like that's really my experience in my 20s, and now going into my 30s, I think like there's a bit more stability. There's a bit more of a kind of equilibrium and awareness. And you to be honest, you're probably already there, because I feel like the things that you've probably been exposed to, the people you've spoken to, the things that you've learned have advanced you a little bit. Maybe not physiologically, but certainly
100%.
You're probably already a little bit ahead of the game.
And my hairline looks like one of a 40-year-old.
I'm going the same way as well. But anyway, I think like sort of taking you back to like some of the people that you might have spoken to in the podcast, some of the people that you'll have read their books, listened to their podcasts. Who are some of the people that have, you know, influenced you in the deepest way?
I hate to hold one story more important than the other, because I think there's value in every single story.
Mm-hmm.
There's lessons for everyone in everyone's story. I guess I better be more sentimental than psychological about this one, and I think it's because I don't want to discourage people from having normal conversations with normal people. But for me, having Sir Tom Hunter, Scotland's richest man, on the podcast, given the fact that he was my first visible role model, was really sentimental to me.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I created a platform that was worthy of him and his story was really sentimental to me. And we're friends now. Every time I have a new achievement, I send it to him, and that was pretty sentimental. Like the fact that I was invited back to my high school to be their celebrity speaker recently,
all right,
and share my story at their end of year graduation thing, and he was that one person for me. It was just sentimental, and I shared that with him. So that has been good for me from a sentimental point of view. There's a couple of guys in Glasgow that have been phenomenal on the podcast, David Galbraith and Stephen Beattie, who have had the most traumatic life close to home and have become really great people and given back and changed their life. The fact that they have become those role models for other people has been brilliant. And then, of course, there's the celebrity spectrum of having like the founder of Reebok or like Jimmy Carr and Example and all these people on the podcast, as well as thinkers that I really love, like Rory Sutherland and Seth Godin and Neri Al. So there's different reasons to why I've enjoyed having different people on. There's the instant gratification of the celebrities, there's the full circle moment with Sir Tom Hunter, and then there's the charitable nature of having other people just like me share their stories.
What about from a philosophical point of view? Who's impacted you the most?
Jimmy Carr.
Jimmy Carr.
He was the most intimidating person I've ever met.
Yeah, you had that respect. You had that. I want to talk to you about that as well, because obviously, you know, I've seen the episode, so much gold in it, deeply impactful episode. It really is a great piece of art. How the hell did that come about?
I paid him £250,000.
To take a loan out?
No, I didn't. I didn't have any connections in the industry. My dad didn't know him. I didn't chat to his agent. I literally just asked him.
How did you do that?
I sent him an email. I guessed his email address.
Guessed it?
I won't say what it is, but I guessed it. I sent one email that day, and he responded the next morning saying, "Excellent, I love the effort that was put into this email. When are you next in London?" And I said, "Jimmy, I'll be in London when you need me in London." He said, "Well, I've got 24 hours in March. I would love to include your podcast in my press run for the new Netflix special." So when I was in London, he also recorded with Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of the CEO and the boys at the Trigonometry podcast, a huge podcast, on the same day, the same 24 hours, and then came to see me.
You're in with the big boys. You are. So how did you go about actually, because I'm assuming you just didn't write, "Can you come on my podcast?" How did you frame the email?
This is horrible, but I was a bit manipulative in terms of human psychology. I signalled to him in the subject line a previous guest of mine, Rory Sutherland, and I know that they've met before, and I know that Jimmy must consume his books or work. Rory Sutherland spoke about him on one of my recent podcasts. I've done 3 episodes with him. So I put in the tagline, "Rory Sutherland spoke about you. How about we speak about him?" So that must have been the trigger that made him open the email, first of all. And then I literally wrote, first thing was, "Hi Jimmy, I want you on my podcast. I know what you're thinking. What a selfish, self-centered cunt. But if you give me 15 seconds and read on, I'll prove to you why that isn't the case. And then the first point was I shared my story. Much like you, I'm a budding working class comedian in a day job. I haven't quit it. Here's all the things that I've learned from your story. I would love to share that lesson forward. The second point was giving myself all the credentials. I've had X amount of views over the last few months. I've been in the Business Insider. I've met the Queen. These are the guests I've had on. I'm Scotland's 20th most entrepreneurial Scotland at the age of 35. All that bells and whistles stuff to prove that I am who I say I am. And then the third one was I can make this super easy for you.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end I said, Jimmy, here's my darkest joke. If you laugh, you must come on the podcast. I'm not going to share it on the podcast. It's way too dark.
Okay.
And you must have liked that joke.
Yeah.
So that was the technique.
Yeah, that's unbelievable, man.
I'm not special, by the way. I just want people to know that they are closer than they think to things that they've always dreamed of.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carr was my idol. I remember vividly. My mum had passed away. I was sitting in my shitty council estate with my little sister, trying to find happiness in the most grave time of my life. And we put on 8 out of 10 Cats. And we laughed alongside Jimmy. And a couple of years later, I brought my sister down from Scotland to meet Jimmy Carr and enjoy that moment together with her. And that was from one email. I was in a cafe in Glasgow with 15 seconds of courage to guess his email address and send it.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened. And people can do that too.
Yeah.
I'm not special.
But I think there's a lot in how you managed to do that. Like the way you framed up that email, you know. I really need to explore this Rory Sutherland character because I've seen him popping up on a few occasions now, and I'm keen to talk to you about some of the things he speaks about. But there's a lot into that. Guessing the email, writing the email. Yeah, it's a cool story, man. It's a cool story.
I've never prepared so much for a podcast. I listened to every stand-up show, every podcast that he'd been on. I read his book about 3 times.
Did you?
The night before the podcast, I locked myself in a hotel room for maybe 24 hours. And my sister was there with her friend. I had a videographer. I brought him down. They went off and did their own thing. And I was basically just leaving me alone for 24 hours. I've never prepared so much.
Did you feel really nervous before it?
Mm-hmm.
Did it feel like the biggest performance of your life?
Yeah. I think people see the end result, right? So they see...
You didn't come across that way.
No. Well, it's a performance, right? It was make or break. I had to go into character.
Yeah.
I was
you
really
were cool as
nervous.
a cucumber, man. You were just chilling. Like.
Yeah, I was just sharing stories. But that's what people don't see. The reason I could be so cool was because the difference between nervousness and excitement is a level of preparation. And I threw the kitchen sink at preparation for that.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't see the fact that I had to welcome Jimmy Carr to this comedy club where the podcast studio was in the basement of, shake his hand, tell him I'm a fan, tell him what was going to go on that day. People don't see that part either. And I was super nervous there.
Mm-hmm.
When we finished the podcast, he said, oh, so what are you up to for the rest of the day? And I said, oh, I'm going to take my sister for a pint and spoons to celebrate. And I was like, what about you, mate? He goes, oh, I'm flying to Las Vegas tonight to start my US tour. And I'm having dinner with Adele, but I think she might cancel on me, so I'm going to reach out to Barry Manilow. And I'm like, lives are very different.
I can imagine him saying that. That is good, man. And I heard them cracking a joke about your sister in the university
So
of the
funny.
podcast. So that's like, she was sitting in the background, wasn't she?
Yeah.
When you were recording.
It's actually hilarious. I'll tell you a quick story. I think your listeners might like this. So when we rocked up to this comedy club, there's a coffee shop in the front entrance of it. And he said to the barista, oh, you'll be out of a job in the morning. And the barista went, what? He goes, this place is going to go up for sale. It's not doing too well. And he goes, can you show me around? So he shows him around this comedy club, which is used as a co-working space during the day. Mm-hmm. And he opens this curtain where everyone was working and the stage was there. Just have a look. And everyone turned to Jimmy and went, and I went, I'm sorry, Jimmy, that happens everywhere I go.
Brilliant.
And then 2 seconds later, my sister's like, okay, is there anything I can do for you, Jimmy? Can I get you a coffee from the coffee shop? And he's like, oh, I'll take an Americano. So me and Jimmy head downstairs and he's cracking jokes about how small this little studio is. He's making jokes that it looks like Joseph Fritzl's basement. And I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
He slaggins me for being Scottish. And then I just see my sister coming down these stairs shaking this cup.
Yeah.
By the time it gets to Jimmy, there's nothing left in it because she's so nervous.
Oh, really?
And everyone in the room, the producer of the podcast, my videographer, everyone's just so nervous because there's an evident superstar in the room.
Yeah. And it sounds like he is just like that, you know, like in terms of how he's going about his business, cracking jokes and very normal. What you see on the TV is what you actually get.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, I get that impression, man. There's some people that you just listen to speaking and telling stories or even making jokes, and you can tell there's a real humility to them. You know, they're really just humble, hardworking people.
I've heard some stories about Jimmy that are not mine to share, but there's comedians that have been struggling in the past, both with health and financial reasons, and he's really helped them out.
Yeah, I can
He's
see
a
him doing
generous
something
man.
like that. He's a fascinating character. So your podcast, where do you want to go with it, man? Talk us through where, in an ideal world, you would see the next few years going.
Just a continuation of this.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I put too much pressure on myself to have more Jimmy Carrs on the episode, then anyone else that I speak to that's not a celebritized guest will be just nothing but a stepping stone. But like I said, all stories hold merit. I'm a curious mind. I've created the university of me. I'm very lucky to have the conversations with some of the most fascinating people I've met, and they're not celebrities. They're sometimes just thinkers or normal people.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to do what I can for that to continue. And if it doesn't, if I get cancelled or podcasting isn't a thing anymore, I'll be glad in retrospect that I did what I did.
Mm-hmm.
I really think my life is. I really think the best frame you can look through life is do things that you're glad in retrospect you did. Optimize for regret minimization. I have this framework or idea of the rocking chair cinema. That doesn't make sense to the listener, but essentially what I think is that when I'm 80, I'm going to be in a rocking chair, and there's going to be two key facets of that. I'll be telling stories to my grandkids. So I want to have a remarkable life where I can tell them the most funniest, hilarious stories.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also going to be a second cinematic experience, and that's where I'm going to be my own thoughts. Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to keep myself company when I'm 18 rocking in this chair. Am I going to be glad that I'm retrospecting over working 40 years in finance, or am I going to be glad that I'm able to remember the one time I spoke to Jimmy Carr by guessing his email? Probably the latter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to optimize for my future self to have a really great cinema of mind to reflect on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most people should think that way too.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean start a podcast with Jimmy Carr. That might mean don't work so hard, spend some time with your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Go to her prom. That might be your cinematic experience when you're 80. That might be your rocking chair moment. Optimize for your rocking chair moments. And that's very personal.
Yeah. I often think about that in terms of like being 30 years old and, you know, in 10 years being 40 years old. And I know that once I get past that stage, I'm probably not going to be able to be in as peak physical condition as I can now. And that's a big inspiration for me right now, is when I think, and I'm 70, if I make it to then, and I'm watching back at my life, I know that the one thing that I would wish that I could have at that point was a body or a level of fitness that I had when I was 35. And that's a big motivator for me training and all the rest of it now. So I do that in certain ways, but maybe I've not thought about it in all areas of my life. Maybe I need to.
It's one thing young grief taught me, is the ability to gamify mortality.
Yeah.
I think more people should think with the frame of mind that tomorrow could be their last day. And write a list of things that they wish they did, conversations they wish they had, people they wish they saw a little bit more. And then think to themselves, well, hopefully tomorrow I'll wake up fine and I can enact all these things. And I think it'll give people more gratitude for life and a greater urgency to do the things that they've not done.
Yeah, a very stoic way of looking at things, that.
It is.
And how has Chris Williamson impacted you? I think I was scrolling through your Instagram and seen that this might have been a while ago, so it's maybe not relevant too much to now, but is he the podcaster that has sort of changed the way you think about things much?
He's a great host. I think he is the best in the world at what he does. I was an early adopter of the Modern Wisdom podcast. I hate when people say that about like bands that they like, but like I generally...
I was first in the door.
I don't mean to sound like one of those. Like, I don't like Mumford and Sons. You can have your Mumford and Sons. I have my Chris Williamson.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was an early adopter of the show, and his audience was like 30,000 followers, which was still quite a lot at the time, but it wasn't anywhere near the size that it is now. And he was very kind to me. He always responded. We always had a chat. He gave me early access to a whole bunch of resources and stuff that he was putting out later down the line. And in December last year, I went to his live show down in London at the Leicester Theatre, and afterwards I had a chat with him, which was really nice. First time I met him in person. And I asked him about the importance of celebrating achievements in the pursuit of turning pro. We came across Stephen Pressfield's book, Turning Pro. I know he lives by that book. And I noticed that I made the awareness that Chris doesn't really celebrate online about his successes. And I asked him, is that because you need to renounce celebration in the pursuit of turning pro? And he says no. He said it's the one thing that he wishes he did in retrospect was celebrate that small milestone, that small victory with the boys, with people that mean a lot to you. So I turned around and said to him, well, I've just published my 100th episode. You're like a digital friend of mine. I'd love to celebrate it with you. And we gave each other a high five and a hug, and it was a beautiful moment. And then I think it was around the same week he released his podcast with Jimmy Carr. And I messaged him saying, this is fucking nuts. Jimmy Carr on your podcast, sharing how much he enjoys the show. This is a huge achievement. Well done, mate. And he was like, oh, thank you, mate. That's super, super kind. And then when I had Jimmy on the show, I replied to that message. You know, you can like pin messages back to him. And I said something like, we did it, baby. And I sent a picture of me and Jimmy back to him. And he was super kind about that.
Because they're good mates now, aren't they?
Yeah, they hang around.
Jimmy seems to have a lot of respect for Chris, from what I've heard on a few different podcasts, which is really cool. But yeah, it's full circle that's like really, really good to see, man.
Chris is such a good host. He's the best in the world at what he does, I think.
Yeah. Trying to think if there's anything else that I want to ask you here. I did have some other questions, but we're hitting about an hour 20, I think now. So, yeah, I guess like the one thing that I do want to actually ask you about is like, obviously you're doing a lot outside a 9 to 5. Like, how do you sort of like organize that work? Like how, in terms of like the processes and systems that you have in place, because there will be people listening to this that maybe have the aspirations of starting something outside their job, but how do you manage all that?
Managing it isn't about time management, it's about energy management. Take stock of your radiators and your drains. What are things that add to your energy when you do them? What are things that make you feel worse when you do? Take stock of that, write a list, and then look at your diary and literally color code your diary. What gives you green energy, positive energy, and what gives you red energy? And if you can remove the red stuff, then do it and optimize for the green stuff. I also think burnout doesn't exist. I'm going to get cancelled here. Burnout doesn't exist in the way we think it exists. I think burnout doesn't occur from thrashing at the metaphorical red zone in a pressure gauge. It's actually from staying stagnant too long in the white.
Is the white then between?
The white's like the bottom end.
Okay.
So it's like a repetition of low frequency, low intensity, no novelty tasks. The reason people go on holiday is not to lie on a beach for 2 weeks. It's because they change their environment, they meet new people and have new experiences. Prove me wrong, really. I think we're not experiencing symptoms of burnout, we're experiencing symptoms of churnout. And people should be asking a question to themselves. Do they need rest or do they just need more novelty and intensity?
Yeah. So
sometimes I take stock of the low frequency, red, energy draining tasks. And sometimes there's weeks where there's too many of them and I'll try to optimize for more fun. People think rest is sitting watching Netflix, but you display just as much energy absorbing that than you would maybe doing a comedy gig or, I don't know, shooting a podcast, for example. Rest is so personalized. So don't let other people's... I think we have rest dysmorphia. We look at other people watching Netflix, getting boozed at the weekend, taking
that's
drugs.
Rest for them, but it's not for us.
Yeah. So personal.
It is so true, man. And I think that's why, again, like, you know, as a professional athlete, you know, we would be around guys who played in the team who their form of rest was going out after a game and having 15 pints. But, you know, someone who maybe didn't drink as much would look at that and they'd say, how can they turn up to training on Monday after that? But that's their rest. It genuinely is. It's how they switch off. It's how they... it's not ideal, but it's how they manage their minds. And it's a really good saying, that rest dysmorphia, because rest for me might be reading a book at night. Rest for you might be watching Netflix. And you
rest
have to
is what
find
gives
your
you
own
energy.
way. Yeah, rest is what gives you energy.
Rest is the moments that you have where your inner monologue doesn't question what you're doing.
Good way to put it. I like that. yeah, it's a constant, for me anyway, it is definitely like a constant battle of getting that balance right, you know, trying to get the work done, but then trying to get certain other things done that I'm working away on the side, even like this podcast. I still do all my editing and stuff myself. But yeah, it's trying to figure out the things that you enjoy doing, and I guess like outsourcing the rest of them. So listen, that has been a fascinating conversation, and I think that you're a really interesting character, man. Honestly, you're young, you're 25, you are very clever for your age. You know, you've definitely spoke to a lot of people and learned a lot of things, and I think the future is really bright for you. So good luck with your podcast, good luck with your stand-up, and yeah, man, keep going. I've got a lot of credit and a lot of respect for people who are putting in the graft like you and starting to do some really cool things. So good on you.
Thanks for having me on, mate. Thank you.